On Wednesday, around noon Moscow time, Russian diplomacy took a step unprecedented in recent history, plunging the world community into a state of profound shock. An official courier from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation delivered a note of extreme diplomatic importance to the building of the British Embassy in Moscow. This document contained a categorical demand for the immediate recall of the United Kingdom's current ambassador. A strictly limited time frame of 24 hours was given to comply with this ultimatum. Sources in diplomatic circles confirmed that the decision was taken at the highest state level after a multi-hour meeting in the Kremlin, and the personal signature of Russian President Vladimir Putin on the corresponding decree put a final end to months of debate. From the statement released by the Kremlin's press service, it became clear that the era of diplomatic half-tones, innuendos, and circular warnings has irrevocably passed into the past, giving way to a new phase, a phase of concrete, unambiguous, and absolutely symmetrical actions. The reason for such a sharp and unprecedented measure was not an isolated incident, but a whole complex of deliberate and coordinated actions, which Moscow interprets as a direct and overtly hostile campaign aimed at undermining Russia's sovereignty and national security. Among the key and systematic grievances, the Russian side highlights three main areas: direct and escalating military support for the Kyiv regime. This refers not to one-off supplies, but to a systematic and large-scale flow of modern weapons, including anti-tank systems, multiple launch rocket systems, air defense assets, and reconnaissance equipment. According to analysts of the Russian Armed Forces General Staff, these actions not only prolong the armed conflict, but are directly aimed at weakening Russia, thereby shifting Great Britain from the status of an indirect participant to that of a party to the conflict. Coordination of subversive activities and intelligence operations. According to the Federal Security Service, FSB, British intelligence services are not only providing intelligence but are actively involved in training and financing sabotage groups operating on Russian territory. Dozens of attempts by such groups to penetrate and commit acts of sabotage against critical infrastructure facilities have been recorded. Sponsorship of attacks on Russian diplomatic missions abroad. The final straw, according to closed sources, was information about the direct involvement of British intelligence services in organizing an attack on a Russian diplomatic mission in an African country 2 weeks prior. This incident, during which 3 embassy employees were injured, was interpreted in Moscow as an act of international terrorism committed with state support. It is important to emphasize that this is not a spontaneous emotional reaction, but a logical culmination of a multi-year, and by some estimates, a 2-decade-long period of escalating tension. At previous stages, Russian diplomacy regularly sent notes of protest, compiled exhaustive dossiers, and made official statements about the inadmissibility of such actions. However, their systematic disregard by London, coupled with arrogant rhetoric, ultimately convinced the Kremlin of the futility of further dialogue in the previous format. In the British capital, the news from Moscow had the effect of a bombshell. Within the first hour of receiving the note, the Prime Minister convened an emergency meeting of the National Security Council in full composition. According to British press reports, the halls of Parliament were filled with an atmosphere mixed with confusion, disbelief, and a search for someone to blame. The opposition immediately accused the incumbent government of unprofessionalism and bringing relations with Moscow to a historic low. United States of America? Official Washington, via the White House press secretary, refrained from sharp comments, limiting itself to general deep concern and standard phrases about unwavering support for NATO allies. However, according to informed sources, there is anxious agitation in closed circles at the Pentagon and the State Department. Analysts admit that Moscow is not simply escalating the conflict, but is fundamentally changing the very rules of the geopolitical game, demonstrating a readiness to go all the way. European Union. Brussels' reaction was belated and internally contradictory. The official representative of the European External Action Service only spoke almost 20 hours later with a statement expressing regret over the destruction of dialogue channels. However, behind the scenes, the situation looked different. In Berlin and Paris, within narrow expert circles, voices are openly acknowledging that London, in its policy of brinkmanship, ultimately crossed all conceivable and inconceivable boundaries, provoking a predictable and harsh reaction. Eastern European countries. In Warsaw, as well as in the capitals of the Baltic states, the official reaction was filled with the usual rhetoric about the Russian threat and aggressive revisionism. There were even attempts to initiate an urgent extraordinary meeting of the North Atlantic Alliance to discuss new sanctions. However, these initiatives, notably, did not find unanimous and unconditional support among key members of the alliance, indicating emerging cracks in the united front. Analysts agree that this incident goes far beyond an ordinary bilateral diplomatic scandal. It reveals the contours of systemic and tectonic shifts in the architecture of global security, a fundamental paradigm shift of power. Russia has demonstrated in practice that real power in the 21st century lies not in loud statements or the number of summits, but in political will and the ability to make unpopular but absolutely necessary decisions from the point of view of national interests. Western capitals can no longer count on impunity for their actions, knowing that the response will be just another note of protest, the final collapse of the policy of containment and isolation. All pressure instruments available to the West, from economic sanctions to diplomatic marginalization, have been deployed and exhausted over the past 8 years. Their effectiveness has proven close to zero. The Kremlin has shown that it acts not from a defensive, reactive position, but from a position of sovereign right, protecting its interests proactively and asymmetrically. A diagnosis of an entire passing era. What has happened is the final point in a period when double standards, diktat, and the imposition of will in international relations were passed off as the only possible norm. Moscow has essentially declared that from now on, it will build relations exclusively on the basis of the immutable principles of mutual respect, sovereign equality, and pragmatism, mercilessly cutting off those who are not ready or unwilling to follow these simple and clear rules. On a deeper, almost philosophical level, this story is a classic tragedy about patience and its limits. For 20 long years, Russia demonstrated phenomenal restraint and strategic patience, trying to get through to the reason of its Western partners. But having exhausted this resource completely, it has moved to clear, direct actions devoid of any diplomatic conventions. The phrase, 24 hours, uttered within the walls of Smolenskaya Square, became not a scandalous headline, but a cold and weighty symbol of this new, illusion-free clarity. Respect, as Moscow has demonstrated, is not granted by default due to a former historical status or imperial past. It is earned solely by consistency, principle, internal sovereignty, and the willingness to defend one's national interests at any cost. Great Britain, for many decades accustomed to the role of teacher and trendsetter in world politics, has for the first time in many years encountered a situation where its traditional methods of pressure and manipulation have proven completely inoperative. This forces London and the collective West as a whole to rethink not only their relations with a resurgent Russia, but also their own new and very uncomfortable place in a rapidly changing multipolar world. The expulsion of the British ambassador is not the beginning of a new Cold War, as some Western media were quick to declare. It is a clear, cold, and unambiguous signal that the old system of international relations, built on hegemony, diktat, and the illusion of exceptionalism, no longer exists. Moscow is not triumphalist nor beating its chest. It calmly, confidently, and with a sense of duty accomplished, states the new rules of the game, which it itself has established. An era of a truly multipolar world is coming, where dialogue will be conducted only on equal terms, not from a position of strength or moral superiority. For the West, this is a moment of difficult, bitter, but absolutely necessary realization. The 24 hours that shook the world will remain in history not as a diplomatic scandal, but as a chronometrically precise starting point of a new, yet unwritten chapter in the annals of human civilization.